So I've been procrastinating making a super deep, it's gonna be the next big thing, you gotta believe me RPG for a while now. Basically imagining DOS 2 meets Morrowind, and also probably gonna turn into Minecraft mid-development because I got some real scope issues. What is a role-playing game? Is this a role-playing game? Is this a role-playing game? Is that what mommy and daddy were doing? Is this a role-playing game? Are you a role-playing game? What is a game? I'm a believer in interpreting things in as literal and simple of terms as possible. So basically I define it as a game about acting, and hopefully you get to come up with your own role, because how are you going to play a character someone else wrote? The game should be a tool for players to make unique stories. I think where most of the confusion comes from is that Dungeons & Dragons is both the pioneer of RPGs, and it also happens to be a strategy game at the same time. So most RPG elements are actually just strategy mechanics. Stats, perk trees, and character progression don't make an RPG, despite the best attempts of the marketing of every non-RPG from the last decade. So in short, this is not an RPG, but what your parents were doing was. But if those things aren't role-playing mechanics, then what is a role-playing mechanic? Well, there's no such thing. I should specify that though in tabletop RPGs, roleplay often means doing voices and speaking in character, not everyone likes that, and I don't really expect players to talk in character at their computer about themselves. That would be weird.
I don't know about rumors.
So let's just say that roleplaying means doing what your character would do instead of doing what you personally would do. But if you think of a shooter game, it's a game that requires you to shoot. It's sort of a test of your skills with the shooting mechanics. And the same could be said for most genres. But I'm not quite sure how you would go about requiring roleplaying from a player. I am sure it wouldn't be fun though. Roleplaying is emergent of other mechanics meeting player intentions. So the best we can really do is make a game in a way that facilitates as much roleplaying as possible, then letting the players find enjoyment on their own terms. That is what I imagine the perfect RPG would look like. Now the reality is that tabletop role-playing games are way closer to this than video games. Because 1, a player's freedom is limited only by their imagination. 2, you get to interact with other players and a game master who are presumably human, so you can dig into fictional interpersonal drama and immersive dialogue where NPCs behave like real people. And 3, the game master can tailor the experience to the group and improvise stuff when needed. But video games are full of limitations, and believe it or not, people are still better at pretending to be people than computers are. Video game developers that see this problem often just try to simulate the tabletop experience directly because that's what they fell in love with. But then why not just play tabletop? Well, I don't have any friends to play with, and video games are cool, so damn it, we're gonna figure this out. As long as we know what the ideal of an RPG is, there's no reason we can't figure out new ways in which video games are uniquely equipped to deliver on it. And if we can figure it out, why don't we get started making it? Right now, if you've noticed, the only thing we've talked about so far is people. Role-playing games are basically just people simulators. The bad news is that people are hard to simulate, but the good news is all we really have to do is make one robust and generic system, and we'll have made the skeleton of an RPG of any setting. That's what we'll be doing in this video. I'll be using Godot, but the basic idea should work with any game engine. Start by making a base actor class for characters to inherit from, which in Godot means making a custom node type that inherits from kinematic body, which I'm gonna be honest, I had no idea you could even do in Godot until recently, and wow, this solves a lot of problems. Why the fuck didn't I start doing this earlier? You just have to make a script that's not attached to any node and put class name and then whatever, and other scripts will be able to inherit from it. In this actor class, we're going to make an empty function called think and call it each frame. Then in each child class's script, we override think with whatever custom game logic that character needs. We don't just override the process function itself, because there's still going to be a lot of shared logic for every character. When we make NPCs, for example, we can put their AI in their think function, but in the case of the player character, we've started by writing a basic character controller. This game is first person in real time because that's one way that digital games can literally put you in the shoes of your character that tabletop can't. But we implemented the actual application of forces as well as deceleration and gravity in the parent class, so all child script has to do is set acceleration. A character system has to define the differences between one character and another in meaningful gameplay terms. Now every RPG has its own way of handling this, but they all have at their core a list of numbers all characters have representing how good they are at doing stuff. Sometimes each character also has different abilities or spells they can use, meaning that as well as being better or worse at certain things, characters can have different options of what they could even try to do in the first place. What's missing from all of this is the question of what your character would do, which is usually just left up to the player's whims. And for good reason. It's difficult to define numerically what someone's personality is. Psychologists have been trying for a long time. There is a Big 5 personality trait model, but it's fuzzy on the details and I can't figure out how to translate them into narrative hammer or game mechanics. But on table tabletop with friends, role-playing comes naturally, at least for players who care, so there's no real need to strictly define a personality. And anytime you try to make players define their characters, then force them to stick to the game master's interpretation of that, it just feels like arbitrary bullshit. But video games are full of limitations and bullshit. See, Divinity Original Sin 2 has this really cool system called tags, where you choose a few descriptors in character creation, and then throughout the game you get unique dialogue options for your tags. The problem is, Divinity Original Sin 2 has this really limiting bullshit where they've cut out some dialogue options and locked them behind a choice in character creation instead of just letting you pick from all the options. What if we just take all the limitations of the video game format and pile them directly on top of the player's tiny bag, crushing their souls, but every now and then we let them choose one burden to be lifted and call that character development. Most ability trees in RPGs already function with the same principle, where you have to meet certain requirements for the ability's associated skills or attributes, whatever they're called. When you think about it, they could have just given you all the abilities from the get-go. It's not that we couldn't be bothered to add a jump button. Your character just doesn't know how to do that. But since the skills already define how well you execute the abilities, why not contextualize the unlock requirements as your personality traits? Ask would rather than can. At any moment you are physically capable of punching someone in the face. If that were only included, Teal Doctor, our character system is going to be something like this. Your traits are numbers that define your personality in context-independent ways, and are going to be gained or lost by choosing certain dialogue/story options that line up with those traits. Actions are things you can do and are unlocked by spending trait points. Skills are numbers that influence how good you are actually using those abilities and are improved as you use them Elder Scrolls style. At first it might seem odd to spend trait points on actions, but this is an elegant way to keep track of when you get to unlock new abilities without needing to have a rigid level up system or XP tracker. You can just have the one variable for each trait, and the player can choose when to buy a new ability. The thing I like about this idea is it allows for a wide range of permutations of character builds. You could have a super strong tough guy who could kick your ass, except he's non-confrontational and would never hit anybody, or vice versa, an angry little scamp who is always hitting people and doing no damage. What specifically the traits and skills are isn't important right now, although you know how I mentioned personality mechanics being arbitrary bullshit? I want to have them each increase through use, so we're storing them as floats, and just exploiting and calculating them rounded down. The fraction portion of the number can act as stat-specific XP points. The actions need a lot of data related to them, so we made an action class that can be accessed globally. In Godot, this is done by declaring it in the standalone script and setting it as a preload in the project settings. Each individual action is just an instance of action, and actors store an array of references to the actions they can use. Give the action class a can function that checks if the action is valid within the context, and the use function that will be run each frame of the action's use. This is just a test action that will last 1 second and print success to the console. Back in the actor parent script, while the action timer is greater than 0, instead of running the think function, the current action's use function is called. It's up to each think function to actually call can though, and set the actor's action timer if can returns no errors. Now there's no reason we can't get started making real actions, so here's a shove action and a dash action. I've made the decision that all actions will have binary results. When you attempt to use one, it first checks if some basic requirements are met, and then does a dice roll to check for success. If you succeed, then it'll be a complete success, and if you fail, nothing happens. This means that the logic always is easy to follow, and the results are always easy to understand. This action says it will do this thing, and sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. It's exciting to succeed and interesting to fail, but everything else in the middle is just boring. It can feel unfair and stupid in these types of games in the early levels when actions keep randomly failing based off of dice rolls. So to even it out, generally we'll have it where you gain XP when an action fails, like your character is learning through failure, and will also organically give progression a curve so you level slower as the game goes on. Speaking of binary results though, hit points are stupid. They're just not how injuries work, and they don't make sense, and they smell like farts. So I succeeded in my attack, or what did it do? You brought him slightly closer to spontaneously collapsing by some arbitrary numerical amount. Good job! There's a much more interesting alternative that already exists in a lot of RPGs, and that's status effects. Basically, each character has a list of things that are happening to them each frame, or turn, or whatever. Some of them have time limits, some have conditions, some are good and some are bad, but they all have immediate and persistent effects on gameplay. Now this basic framework can be very versatile. For example, here we have a bleeding effect as an injury, but we can also reuse the same system for unlockable passive abilities, since those are just things we want to happen to a character each frame. We've made our effects a class with a apply method that does whatever the effect is supposed to do, and gave the actor class a list of instances of these objects that are looped through each frame before doing anything else. For this stage of development, I thought I'd just make one status effect on top of the two actions we already have, but I kept finding that my ideas for status effects were all interconnected. The first one I thought of was bleeding effect, which would act as a timer to death, where if you let it time out, you die. But then I thought maybe being dead should just be another status effect. That way we won't have to worry about having pointers to no longer existing characters. Okay, so what does being dead do? Well, it makes it where you can't do anything, and it knocks you down, and oh yeah, we're probably going to need a prone status effect anyway, so these three effects leading into each other give us a good idea of how the status effect system might work at scale. So, good job me, I guess. As far as the interface goes, there's not much I can think of for displaying the status effects besides just having their icons appear in the corner of the screen. The player can check the specifics of each effect in a menu, and they'll just have to remember what each icon means. The solution isn't great, but it's simple. The action selection, on the other hand, is a little less simple. Normally, games that just give the player a huge list of actions to choose from are either turn-based or real-time with pause, because players have to be able to use each action instantly without going into a menu to equip them. But you can't just have buttons mapped to every action. No one would be able to remember that, and it would only work on keyboard. We are going with a Minecraft-style toolbar you can scroll through for now. I told you Minecraft would be a part of this. I tried messing with the engine's timescale to create time dilation when you start scrolling through the actions to decrease the delay of finding the right action, but that created a bunch of problems with the movement system. I found it was easier to make the game pause for a moment instead of slowing down. Who knew the solution to making a real-time game use mechanics from real-time with pause was to make it with pause. Looks less cool, but gets the job done. When I said easier, I didn't mean that much easier though. When the game is paused, we had an issue where all the players' processing was, well, paused, so you couldn't scroll through the actions during the time stop, which defeated the purpose. Because of that and some other issues with UI, let's give the HUD its own script and set it to process even when the game is paused. And really, do yourself a favor and separate out the HUD and game logic. Don't ask why, just do it. All of this bullshit is just for running the interface alone. Most of it's just the pause menu. The reality is a lot of making RPGs comes down to menus and shit, which is extremely boring, but it's better to get out of the way early. Here I expanded on the action system, implementing menus for you to spend trait points to unlock them, then equip them. You can just assume to add phases of menu integration in between every step, although I won't go into more. What makes all this important is feedback and communication of mechanics, which is especially important for complicated games like this. Right now, we just have error messages appear when an action fails, which is the bare minimum, although we won't be adding sound at this stage. A good example of feedback would be to have 3 different sound effects based off of the result of an action. If the action fails because of some condition, then one sound could be played. If it fails because of a dice roll, there could be a fail sound, and each action could have its own sound for successful use. So I'll admit, I kinda lied when I said all we were doing was making a character system. Or maybe I'm just wrong. I don't know. The problem is that it's really hard to draw the line between part of the character system and not, because in these kinds of games everything is connected. Technically we could have just made the actor class, but it would be meaningless without the actions class or the effects. So are the actions and status effects a part of the character system? I mean, I guess. But on the other hand, a dialogue system and AI are both pretty essential, and they're certainly part of the character system, but those are so complicated they'll have to be their own stage of development altogether. But we can easily make an inventory system for our characters in this stage, but that would mean making items, which are definitely outside of the character system. But oh wait, the game logics for the items would have to be interactable somehow. Oh shit, I just realized we really need a system for interactables, and that's what I've been coding in the background this whole time. This is just a test interactable that prints the player's name when interacted with, but the general system is that interactables are game objects with the tag interactable, which in Godot terms means putting them in the group interactable. Then it has an interaction function that an actor calls when they want to use it. And then in the player's think function, we do a raycast when you right click, and if an interactable is hit, then we call it the target's interaction. The reason you want to use groups or tags instead of making a custom node type like with the actors is that interactables could be any range of things, needing to inherit from all kinds of nodes. and unfortunately in programming, classes can only inherit from one lineage. This example Interactable is easy to implement, but my real point is that I was hoping to be able to make all the base systems for an awesome RPG in about a month, but every time I think about it, those parameters get a little bigger. Back to the items though. If you've seen my video about making a game where you share bodies with an enemy, the items system kind of works like that, where having them gives you access to new actions, except that you can have a bunch of items at once, and each item can have multiple actions. Unlike unlocking the other actions, you don't spend trait points on item actions, they just appear or disappear depending on whether you have enough trait points. This is a little different from other RPGs because you don't equip items or weapons, just having it gives you the actions. Maybe less realistic, but being able to carry all those weapons in other games is unrealistic anyways. At least this makes things simpler for the player. This one is a knife, and it gives you the stab action, stabby stabby. The set's bleeding on successful use. You can't really tell, but he's bleeding right now. There, he died. But it also gives you Throat Slit, which has a very high requirement of aggression and low chance to succeed, but you can insta-kill. I'll admit even I got a little confused making the items system. There has to be an abstract class for the data related to items that actors can store references to in an array just like the actions, but then there has to be an actual game object for each item, which is an interactable that destroys itself and adds its associated item data to the user's inventory on interaction. And then of course we have to double check the trait requirements every frame, because your traits could change at any time. To generalize item game objects, we can make a custom node type by making a script called item object, in this case inheriting from a rigid body because I like having them all be physicsed out, and make it interactable. Then for any items you want to make, you can just make a scene of type item object, and you just gotta specify the item data in the child's script. The way I've set this up, an item's actions don't get added to the actor's action list represented here. They are just kept in the item data. This is because the base actions that you can unlock in the item actions work so differently, like how the stab keeps going in and out depending on how many aggression points you have, whereas the shove just stays forever. But what if I told you none of this really matters? And I don't mean the inventory system. I mean everything. You're probably thinking, go fuck yourself. And I must inform you, I already did. But leave personal lives out of this. As much as I would like to make a set of systems so thick they could be great RPG on their own, every great RPG is ultimately great because of its content, the stories, the sandbox, and systems without content are pointless. You could make any game into an RPG if you gave it enough player expression on top of its base systems. So actually never mind, we can go back to what we were doing. What I meant to say was, what if I told you this is just the first step?